Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is the Living Life Between Two Worlds channel, and this channel is a godly ministry channel about transgenderism. And I'm your host, Mike Joels. And on this channel, I'm going to be presenting various videos about different aspects of transgenderism. And in this video, I'll be presenting my personal testimony about how transgenderism affected and controlled my life. You may be asking, well, why are you making this video and how can I discuss this topic? And the reason is because I lived with the transgender mind for over 30 years, almost 35 years. And during that time, transgenderism controlled my life. I hated what I was, and I thought it would be better if I could live life as the opposite sex, as a female. And this would continue until the year 2000, when God came to me, showed me the truth about transgenderism, and set me free. And on that day when God came to me, I went from being enslaved by the problem to being free from it. It was an amazing divine deliverance experience that I want to share with you. But my journey with God did not stop with being set free. God told me to go tell my story so others could realize that freedom was possible through Him. So God led me to write a book that tells what He did for me. And the book I'm showing you here is named Living Life Between Two Worlds. It tells the story of my struggle with transgenderism. It tells the truth that God revealed that set me free. It also discusses the truth about sexuality and the theories about transgenderism and how they are not true. These are just a few things my book discusses. So if after watching this video you have questions, or perhaps you want to have a reference to the book so you can understand transgenderism better, you may want to get a copy of my book. And you can find my book on Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, and in the iTunes store. And there are print copies available as well as electronic versions for the Nook and the Kindle. And to search for my book, search for my name, Mike Joels, or the book title, Living Life Between Two Worlds. Make sure you surround either text with quote marks as shown here in the video. Doing this should make the search results come to the top of your browser window, and you won't have to do a lot of scrolling. Also, if you'd like to contact me with questions, or perhaps you'd like me to come speak at your organization or church, here is my contact information. Finally, I plan to have other videos on this topic, and you can find them as I make them available by searching for my name, Mike Joels, or the text Transgender Deliverance as shown here. And again, notice how the search text is surrounded with quote marks as shown for the same reason that you did when searching for my book. Okay, well, that's a short introduction to the video and how to find my book. So before starting my personal testimony, I'd like to give you some background into transgenderism and what causes it to happen. And first, I'd like to start with the definition. So transgenderism is a state of mind where a person is uncomfortable or unhappy with their birth sex, and they think that it would be better if they could live their life as the opposite sex. So given that definition, let's talk about some of the major theories that try to explain why the problem happens. And there are two major theories that I'm aware of that try to explain the cause of transgenderism. The first theory is the biological cause theory, and it suggests that transgenderism is caused by a malfunction in the person's biology. And this malfunction then causes a predisposition to transgenderism. The biological malfunction premise has also been used to try and explain the occurrence of homosexuality. In the context of this video, I'm going to limit its use to transgenderism. The short version of this theory is that people are, quote unquote, born this way, and therefore they can't help how they feel. And you may have heard of this theory in the media or public discussions. Over the years, many studies have been done to prove this theory, and the results of these studies have yielded insufficient evidence. So as a result, most scientists who look at the results in the data agree that transgenderism is not a biologically caused problem. Okay, well, that was the first theory. The second theory is that transgenderism is caused by psychological factors. And there are several proponents of this thinking. I will quote one source here to save time. Her name is Melissa Fry-Rear. And Ms. Fry-Rear is a Christian counselor who deals with people with sexual identity disorders. And she says that from her experiences in counseling, she finds that sexual identity can be damaged because of emotional abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. And she says that an alternate sexual lifestyle can be chosen if enough of these negative psychological events happen to a person such that the person reaches a breaking point where they hate their natural sexual identity. Ms. Fry-Rear also states that these abuse events do not always cause the person to choose an alternate sexual lifestyle. However, she does say that if such a choice is made, these abuse events are almost always present. So because of my life experiences, I agree with Ms. Fry-Rear. And in addition to agreeing with Ms. Fry-Rear, I also believe that sexual perceptions can affect sexual identity. And you will also see this in my testimony. I believe that if a person has a sexual perception and they dwell on that perception enough, that perception could affect the person's sexual identity. So with this introduction completed, let me begin my testimony. I'll talk about the factors and events that happened in my life that sent me down the transgender path. I'll also tell you how God would eventually come to me and bring me out. So the earliest factor that would affect me was divorce. My parents got married and then I came along. Eventually, my father decided he wanted to change careers and he began to work toward that goal. And he was so immersed in his goal that it put excessive stress on the marriage. This would lead to divorce when I was around 2 years old. As a result, I grew up without the benefit of a father. And if you know anything about kids, you know that a child learns about his or her sex from the same-sex parent. Of course, I didn't have that benefit. I should say that many children grow up just fine in a single-parent family, and this is not a death sentence. However, it was a factor, although a small one. I think a bigger factor that would affect me from day one would be my eyesight. It would indirectly affect many aspects of my life. You see, I was born with a birth defect that damaged my eyesight. I was born legally blind. And what that meant was that I would be severely nearsighted for my entire life. And this meant that I would have to be extremely close to things to see them, and I couldn't easily see things in the distance. So if something was small and in the distance, I probably wouldn't be able to see it at all. And my eyesight would prevent me from doing things that people with normal vision simply take for granted, such as reading a blackboard in class. And even sitting on the front row of a class, I still couldn't read what was written on the board. My eyesight would also prevent me from doing things such as riding a bicycle or playing sports. And again, you have to be able to see into the distance to do those activities, and I simply couldn't do that. So if riding a bicycle wasn't possible, then driving a car would not be possible either. And additionally, my vision would also affect personal relationships and how people treated me. So after talking about my eyesight, let me tell you about other events that would happen later that would also influence my life. So the first event that would influence me was peer rejection. And this happened as early as age 5 or 6 years old. This happened with my neighborhood peers and peers when I attended summer camp. And in both cases, other boys would be playing games such as softball, baseball, football, and so on. My eyesight, unfortunately, did not allow me to see the ball easily. It didn't take the other kids very long to realize this, and as a result, they didn't want me to play with them because I couldn't help them win. This was especially evident at summer camp with team sports. And once the kids realized my deficiency, I was always picked last. It didn't take long for me to realize that nobody wanted me. Well, unfortunately, rejection by my peers was not the only event that influenced me. Another event was physical abuse in elementary school, and this happened from age 5 to 9. So when I began attending elementary school, I tried to make friends, but I suppose the kids were just mean because I got beaten up quite frequently. I never knew what I did to justify this treatment. I also never knew when it would happen. And it would happen in the bathroom or on the playground. It could happen at any time. And as time went on, I became very cautious about making friends. And there were times when I thought I would get beaten up at school, so I would pretend I was sick and stay home to avoid school. And because of the treatment that I received, I retreated into my shell, and I was very cautious. I wondered how boys could be so cruel to other boys. Well, one thing that did happen when I was in elementary school was that I noticed girls around the age of 8. And what I noticed was that when they interacted with each other, they didn't seem to treat each other the way I was treated. They seemed to be happier and friendlier, something that was not in my experience. And while I didn't want to be a girl at that time, I did notice that they seemed to have a better experience than I was having. So if being rejected and receiving physical abuse wasn't enough, there was a third event that happened to me, and that was sexual abuse. There were 2 events that occurred to me. First was at age 8 or 9 by an older neighborhood boy, and the second event was when I was 12 or 13 in the Boy Scouts. I didn't ask for either event to happen, but once again, I wondered how boys could be so cruel to other boys. So, how did these events affect me? Well, first, I perceived I would never be accepted. I knew that people didn't want me because of my eyesight, and since I knew that the doctors couldn't fix my vision, I reasoned that nobody would ever want me. Second, I had enough experience to know how cruel boys could be. And third, I saw that I couldn't trust anybody. So because of my experiences, I was very cautious about making friends, not knowing how people would treat me. And all of these events made me feel unwanted and unloved. The bottom line was that I hated my life. It was these experiences that set the stage for what was about to happen to me. And there would be 3 major events that would happen in my life next that would push me over the edge and send me down the transgender path. So event number 1 was junior high, puberty, and noticing girls sexually. And this happened around age 12. And as I entered junior high, I noticed that puberty was a thing. Everybody was changing. The boys were changing. The girls were changing. It didn't take much to see that girls were pretty. They also appeared to be happy and friendly. That is, happier and friendlier than I had been in my experiences. And through these observations, I perceived that they didn't have to deal with cruelty. Of course, we know that girls can be mean and cruel to other girls, but I didn't know that at that time. Another perception I had was that girls were loved by others. I compared that to my own experience, and I knew I was not. And these observations led me to consider that a female's life was superior to mine. It also made me wonder what life was like for girls. Event number 2 happened when I learned about reincarnation. And this happened in a social studies class around age 12. And in this class, we learned about different cultures. One concept we learned was that some cultures believed in reincarnation, where you can live life as one being, die, and then be reborn as another being. And when we learned that concept, I put it back in my mind as a fact, since facts are what you learned in school. And the third event that happened to me that would affect me was that I learned that my mother had had a stillborn daughter before I was born. So, how did these 3 events affect me? Well, first, given everything in my past, I hated my life. I didn't see anything good in the experience I was living. Second of all, I had started noticing girls. They were attractive and desirable. My perception was that they didn't have to deal with cruelty. I also perceived they had a better life and that they appeared to be loved, whereas I was not. And third, I considered the stillborn daughter before me, and I also considered the idea of reincarnation. I then put the 2 thoughts together and asked the question, was I supposed to be a girl? These thoughts led me to wonder if I could have had a better life and a happier life as a girl. And if reincarnation was true, I wondered if it was possible that I should have been the girl, but I died and I was reborn as a boy. And if all of this was true, I reasoned I had been deprived of a life where I could have been happy as a girl. Because look at my life, it was terrible as far as I was concerned. So all of these ideas went round and round in my mind until one day I had what I call my quote-unquote defining moment. And while walking home from school one day, I decided that I hated my life and that it would have been better if I had been born a female. And at that moment in time, I didn't understand the psychological factors that impacted me. They were all pushed deep into my subconscious mind. All I knew was that I hated my life and that I should have been a girl. Well, I'm going to pause from my testimony for a moment and say that I hope you can see the truth of Ms. Fryrear's work. You'll recall that she said that sufficient negative emotional events can cause the person to hate their life enough to make them choose an alternate sexual identity. And although I didn't know it at the time, that was exactly where I was. Well, after I had my defining moment, I lived the rest of high school and college in conflict. My male identity was shattered, and I hated my life. And a war raged in my mind. I was living in two worlds. One world was what I was physically, a male. The other world was what I thought I wanted to be, a female. I was, quote unquote, living life between two worlds. You may recall at the beginning of this video that this is the title of my book, Living Life Between Two Worlds. The book got its name because this phrase represents the mental struggle that takes place in the transgender mind. Unfortunately, I lived with this struggle almost daily. And there were some days when the struggle didn't exist, but most days it did. And many times thoughts would come into my mind out of nowhere that intensified the conflict and made it worse. Thoughts such as, you were supposed to be a girl, or you were deprived of a happy life as a girl, or being a female was what you were supposed to be. And these thoughts were relentless, and they were destructive, and they intensified the conflict that existed within me. And with time and repetition of hearing them over and over, I eventually internalized them and thought that this was just part of who I was. So with everything that was going on through my mind, I began going down the transgender path. And my path would include secret cross-dressing sessions where I had fantasies about being the opposite sex. And these sessions were always followed by guilt. The transgender thoughts were also intensified when one summer day, while I was still in high school, I discovered daytime TV talk shows. And on one such episode, it featured transsexuals. And they related their experiences about how they had hated their life and they wanted to be the opposite sex. And some had already had their sex change, others were preparing for them. It should not be surprising that I identified with what I saw immediately. Watching that program intensified the thoughts that were already present in my mind. And a third thing that happened to me in my journey was in college when I read the book, Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Sex But Was Afraid to Ask. And in that book, I learned about the sex change process and how it was possible. I knew after reading that this was what I wanted. And the result of all these influences was that they reinforced the conflict even more than before, and I became a slave to the problem. Well, at this point, I should say that if there is a lesson to be learned from all of this that I've related, that lesson is that the more you dwell on something sinful, the more you become a slave to it, and the more that it controls you. And that was exactly where I was, although I wasn't aware of it. I should also say that with everything I was doing, I lived with a lot of guilt for thinking about this, and somehow I thought it was wrong. I wanted to be free from this, and I wanted to be, quote unquote, happy in my own skin, as the expression goes. Unfortunately, I didn't know how to do that. I prayed to God many, many times to help me out of the problem, but I got no answers. So after school, I began my career. And at this point, I had seen enough and thought about it enough to know that I wanted to change my sex and live as a female. I realized that in my career, I could make money that would help me make my thoughts a reality. And I decided that this was exactly what I would do. But at this point in my testimony, I have to say, but God. Because even at this point, back in the fall of 1978, God knew that he would eventually use me for his purpose. But if he was going to do that, he would have to put roadblocks in my path to stop me from doing what I had already determined to do. And I'd like to talk about those roadblocks right now. So the first roadblock God put in my path was that I became a Christian. And I was home from work one night watching TV, and I came across a religious TV program. And on this program, they were talking about sin and a person's need for Jesus to forgive the sin. I suppose they must have made a good argument, because on that night, I prayed to God to forgive my sins, and I became a Christian. The second roadblock that God put in my path was church. And that must have happened somewhere in the spring or fall of 1979. It was at that time I began attending the Baptist church. This was important because it was here that I would begin to learn the truth about God. And this was significant because church was not on my radar. In fact, I had no intention of going to church. And even if I had, I couldn't have gotten there because, as I told you earlier, I can't drive a car. Therefore, there was no way I could have gotten to church even if I was thinking about doing it, which I wasn't. But God knew that I needed to hear the truth, and so to make that happen, he used a haircut to put a little old church lady in my path who would take me to church. And one weekend, I needed to get my hair cut. So I looked in the phone book and picked out a hair salon totally at random. And I knew that to get to the appointment, I would have to take a bus or a taxi cab because I couldn't drive a car. And once the haircut was done, I asked the salon manager if I could use the phone to call for a taxi to take me home. And it was at this point that the little old church lady crossed my path. She had made her appointment for the same day, and she heard what I needed and offered me a ride home. And not seeing any problem in this, I accepted. And it was on this ride home that she was bold, and she asked me if I was going to church anywhere and if I would like to go. And for some odd reason, I accepted her invitation. And from that point on, I was attending church and learning about God. I believe this event was not coincidence. I could have picked any other salon. I could have picked a different day or time when she wasn't going to be there. And add to that, she was willing to listen to God and give me a ride, something that many people would not be willing to do. And all of this and more tell me that this was God working to put me in church where I needed to hear the truth. What I can say is that without this happening, I likely would have never darkened the door of any church. And I would have probably done what I was already determined to do. That is, change my sex and destroy my life. So looking back, I can see that this was God working all the way. And it's a sobering thought that had I not gone to that salon on that day, my life would have probably been very different today. Well, the third roadblock that God put in my path was meeting the girl that I would eventually marry. And I had been going to this church for several months, and it was there in the spring of 1980 that I met the girl that would eventually become my wife. And at first I didn't want to date her, but when I finally did, I found that when I was with her, I didn't have the thoughts of being the opposite sex. In fact, I enjoyed her company very much. And in church, we learned that God has plans for our lives. And since I enjoyed being with her, I wondered if she was part of God's plan for my life, and if this was God's way out of the conflict I had been struggling with for so many years. I was hoping that it was. We continued to date, and finally in 1981, we got married. And I remember I was very happy when that happened. But unfortunately, salvation had not immediately eliminated the problem. The root psychological causes had not been understood or dealt with, and therefore the thoughts eventually resurfaced after a couple of years of marriage. And by this time, we had started a family. And what I knew was that I loved my wife and my kids, and I did not want this problem. I wanted to be free from it. I just wanted to be happy with who I was. And I prayed to God to help me, but I got no answers. All I felt I could do was live with the roller coaster ride of emotion that followed. And this would continue for several years. Then in 1995, another significant event happened, and that would send me even further down the transgender path. And that event was the internet. And in 1995, everyone was talking about the internet at work, and I wanted to find out more about it. So I decided to sign up and get online. And America Online, or AOL as it was called, was one of the major providers at the time. So I requested my software and got the CD in the mail one day. It came inside of a disc jacket, and on the outside of the jacket was a picture of a guy named John. Underneath John's picture, it said, "John uses AOL to explore his feminine side." Well, with my background, that was the mental key that turned the ignition in my mind. I saw AOL as an opportunity to find out about transgenderism. And I activated my account, and everyone in my family was online. For me, I would wait until late at night when everyone was asleep, and then I would search for information on transgenderism or transsexuality. I spent 10 hours a week, sometimes 12, sometimes even 15 hours a week looking at this information. And the result was that I learned everything about transgenderism. Of course, that was bad because as I did this, I became a slave to it even more. And it controlled my thoughts. It was also good because when God eventually brought me out and set me free, I knew enough that I could talk about this topic intelligently. But make no mistake, at the time doing this caused nothing but problems for me. This would go on for about 5 years. Then one night in the year 2000, I had an important divine experience with God. I was surfing on the internet looking at a site about the sex change process. And it was on that night that God's Spirit came to me and confronted me about what I was looking at. I suppose God felt I had been doing this for long enough, and it was time He confronted me about it. So while I was looking at the web page, God's Spirit locked onto my mind, and I could tell something was different, but I couldn't tell what it was until I heard a question in my mind. And the Spirit asked me, "Can people really change their sex?" Well, this was not a question that was open for debate. The Spirit was about to unload truth on me that would tell me that what I was thinking about was a sin and a lie, and that God was against it. And the Spirit started out by reminding me about all the things that I had already learned on the internet about sex change. First, He reminded me that the sex change process cannot change the person's DNA. And He told me they have the same sex DNA when it's all done as they did before they started. Thus, genetically speaking, they are the same person before and after. And I had to agree with this since that's exactly what I had read online. Second, the Spirit reminded me that the hormones that the transgender person takes can only make them look like the opposite sex externally. The hormones do not magically change the sex organs on the inside into the opposite sex organs. Third, the Spirit reminded me that during sex change, the natural sex organs are removed and opposite sex organs are not transplanted. So therefore, the person ends up as a sterile, non-sexual person. Fourth, the Spirit tied everything together and told me that because of all of this, the person could never, emphasize never, truly fulfill the role of the opposite sex. They might look like the opposite sex on the outside, but inside they were a sterile shell. He also told me that they were believing and living a lie if they believed that they could truly be the opposite sex. And the Spirit then ended that part of the confrontation by saying that transgenderism can therefore not deliver what it promises, and therefore it is a lie. Well, I couldn't argue with any of this since this is exactly what I had read online. But the Spirit did not stop there. He then took me to scriptures in the Bible that talk about alternate sexual lifestyles and tells us what God thinks about them. And on this night, the Spirit recalled verses I had read from the book of Romans, specifically Romans chapter 1, verses 24 to 27, and Romans chapter 1, verse 30. And these verses can be found in the New Testament in case you want to look them up. So let me read these verses to you now, and we'll start with Romans chapter 1, verses 24 to 27, which discusses homosexuals and lesbians. So here are the verses. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections. For even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the women, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves the recompense of their error, which was meet. Okay, well, after relating these verses, the Spirit finished by recalling Romans chapter 1, verse 30, which tells what God thinks about these lifestyles. And it says, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. So the Spirit then paused for a moment to let these verses sink in. And then he began to explain their meaning. He told me that Romans chapter 1, verses 24 to 27 speaks about lesbians and homosexuals. And I couldn't argue with that because they are specifically named in the verses. And then he started telling me what they had done. First, they gave up God's created sexuality, males with females. Second, they exchanged it for sexuality that they wanted, men with men or women with women. Third, they dishonored their bodies by doing what they did. And fourth, they exchanged the truth for a lie. And finally, he told me that according to Romans chapter 1, verse 30, they are worthy of death and under judgment for doing these things. And I couldn't argue with any of this because that's exactly what the verses said. Well, the Spirit then paused for a moment, and then he threw a curveball at me that I was not expecting. He told me that even though the word transgender doesn't appear in the Bible, they are guilty of the same behaviors and are also guilty and worthy of death and judgment. He said that the transgenders gave up God's created sexuality. Second, they exchanged God's sexuality for sexuality they wanted. And third, they dishonored their body. And what can you say about destroying the sex that God gave you by having surgery? And finally, as already discussed, they exchanged God's truth for a lie. And to summarize it, the Spirit said that the transgenders are guilty because they fulfill the intent of what Romans chapter 1, verse 24 to 27 is talking about. They may not fulfill it with exactly the same behavior as lesbians or homosexuals, but their behavior departs from what God created and intended, and therefore they are equally guilty, even though the word transgender never appears in the Bible. And the Spirit then elaborated further about judgment, and he told me that this judgment is not just for homosexuals, lesbians, or even transgenders. It is for any, emphasize any, sexual choice that departs from what God ordained and which fulfills the intent of Romans chapter 1, verses 24 to 27. This could also include gender fluidity, which we hear about today, which says there are many sexualities that exist between male and female. We should understand that these choices also give up God's intended sexuality, and therefore they are also under judgment. Well, the Spirit then concluded this part of the discussion by saying that God does have an opinion. on transgenders, and that even though the transgender or those in the LGBTQ aren't judged today, they will be judged eventually if they do not repent and turn away from their sins. So at this point, I knew that God was speaking directly to me about what I was thinking about. And I realized that if I ever did what I was thinking about, I would be under judgment by God. But even with all that, God still wasn't finished. He then proceeded to recall to my mind the childhood factors and events that had driven me to where I was. And he showed me that my thinking was a product of the childhood abuse I had experienced. Then he told me these events, not biology, were the cause of my problem. And because of that, I realized that transgenderism wasn't a genetic part of me, and that I wasn't, quote unquote, born that way. And this was something I had heard over the years and had halfway believed. But the Spirit, however, showed me that this was not true. He also showed me that I had believed a lie. So when this truth was revealed, I realized my guilt before God, and I spiritually fell on my face before him, and I begged forgiveness. And then an amazing thing happened. The nagging thoughts in my mind that had been driving me for so long suddenly disappeared. They were gone completely. And then in the same moment, God forgave me and set me free. God did what I tried to do in my own strength, but could not do. And then God also showed me in that moment that he can forgive even the transgender who has gone through the entire sex change process if they repent and turn away from the lifestyle and follow him. Well, after all of this, God then made me realize several things. First, transgenderism is not immutable and unchangeable. And if it was unchangeable, God could have never changed my mind and set me free. And second of all, God showed that he has power and control over the problem. He demonstrated that by setting me free when I was powerless against the problem. He also made the conflicting thoughts in my mind disappear. So he had to have control if he could do that. Third, he made me realize that the thoughts in my mind were not part of my being. Had they been, God could have never done anything about them. And fourth, God made me understand that since these thoughts were destructive and not part of my being, they were spiritual temptations from dark forces, in other words, Satan and his demons. So finally, given all the above, God showed me that spiritual warfare is involved in transgenderism. It is not simply a human condition. And in the interest of time, because I could talk more at length about spiritual warfare, this is as much as I'm going to say about spiritual warfare and transgenderism in this video. But if you're interested in hearing more about how spiritual warfare is connected to transgenderism, you can read more in my book in the chapter Transsexuality and Spiritual Warfare. I also plan to have another video on YouTube that goes into more detail on this topic. And that video will be entitled Transgenderism and Spiritual Warfare. And you'll see it there on your screen. And when searching for the video on YouTube, keep in mind the use of quotes as shown here in this video. And so with everything that had just happened to me, I realized that it was God's power that had brought me out and that I was in God's presence. And it was the most amazing experience I have had or probably ever will have. All the truth that God revealed seemed to flow in a matter of seconds, like the time it takes for lightning to strike the ground. And I could also compare this to the time it takes for a light to turn on when you flip the light switch. It's instantaneous. And in that moment, you go from darkness to light. And in those moments when God revealed the truth, I went from death unto life, from darkness unto light. And because of this comparison to lightning striking the ground, I call this my lightning bolt moment. And let me say that when this happened and you are in God's presence, nothing else matters. Anything and everything else pales in comparison to God in this moment. And being in God's presence is better than the most money, the biggest house, the best vacation, the best anything. Basically, nothing else compares. And besides being blown away like this, God gave me something else. He gave me a peace that was so big that words cannot describe it. It was his peace that made me realize he is everything and anything else is not important. It was the most wonderful experience I've ever had. And let me just say that even though I've tried to describe this event, no words can describe how big this was or how big God's peace is. You simply have to experience it to believe it. But if I were to try to describe it, I might use these words. I had a clarity of truth. I was humbled before him. I had a hunger for God. Nothing else mattered but him. I had freedom and deliverance. I had peace. And basically, I never wanted it to end. So you can see that I went from darkness and death to light and freedom. And that is my testimony about how God came and set me free from transgenderism, a problem that is nothing but heartache. So let's wrap this up. So where do we go from here? Well, God didn't stop with deliverance. About 10 years after he set me free, he set me on a path to share my story. I began working on my book a little after 2010, and I finally published it in 2019. And in 2020, God laid it on my heart to create YouTube presence as another way to get the word out. And since you're watching this video, you can see I've been working on that. And the purpose of everything I've done is to tell the transgendered and the LGBTQ that there is hope and freedom from the problem through God. And beyond writing my book and making YouTube videos, God has also told me to go speak at churches. And I'm working on that too. And the purpose is to share my testimony of God's transformative power. And second, to tell churches that God wants the transgendered and the LGBTQ reached, so that lives can be changed just as mine was changed. And this means that the church should not shut their doors, but rather welcome the transgendered so they can hear the truth. And the church should understand that welcoming does not mean condoning a lifestyle. For how can the LGBTQ person know the truth or have any hope of freedom if the church, which has the truth, does nothing to help them or closes its doors? The answer is they can't. So I hope that the church will realize that they can have a part in God's transformative work. After all, you never know how God can change a person or how he will use them. Look at me. I believe God wants the church to be part of that process. So with all of this said, that's the end of my testimony video. I hope that you see that God can change lives. And if you're watching this video today and you're trapped in the transgenderism, I hope you know that God can bring you out. Or maybe you're watching and you know someone who's trapped. I hope you'll get a copy of my book and give it to them or tell them about this video. And I want to end by saying thank you for watching this video. I hope that it provided insight into a topic that you may not have known much about. And so until the next video, I want to pray that God will bless you. And also, never forget that God loves you.